this computer. All right, hi everybody. Welcome to How to Rock the Technical Interview with our very own Chris Dopuch, one of my favorite people of all times. Hi, Chris. Let me disable the waiting room real quick because I'll get totally distracted. And okay, waiting room disabled. So hi, welcome. Before we jump into this session, I want to take a quick minute to, I'm going to do a mute there. I'm going to take a quick minute to walk through where you should be in your career lab journey and what things should be next for you. So let me share my screen real quick. And I'll share this one. Okay, so if you look at the Career Lab repo that you all have access to and have been following for content and resource for Career Lab, on the first page, as you know, you can see the schedule for things that we're going to be doing. So we're here on Sunday, December 5th, and we have How to Rock the Technical Interview right now, followed directly by the intro to the take-home assignment with Caitlin Greffley. After this day, you should know how to start your take-home assignment. And so what you should do is work on completing that. And part of that is pairing up with somebody that you can find on this page here to just talk about how to get started. And we'll go a little deeper into that on the next session. But you'll pair up with somebody, get started on that take-home assignment. You each need your own take-home assignment. So don't work on the same one, but kind of collaborate on the approach to it. And then complete your take-home assignment, send it to the person you're going to do a technical interview with. And then later this week, which I'm sure you already have scheduled, but if you don't, please be sure to check out the mentor you're paired with here and schedule these interviews. Later in the week, you'll have your technical mock interview and your job fit mock interview. And then on Thursday, we will be having 2 sessions this time where you can watch our mentors interview each other. So you can see how some more experienced people will respond to some of these interview questions. So this earlier session, the 10 a.m. one, we have Dan Abramoff, who's a JavaScript React kind of celeb in the community, doing a technical mock interview, and that will probably take about the whole session. And then the later session will be Andrew interviewing me in a job fit interview and April interviewing Lewis in a technical mock interview. And I'm going to, since we have Dan, who's like super experienced and stuff, doing an interview earlier in the morning, I'm going to kind of take a step back in time and approach my job fit interview that I do in front of you all as if I am just getting into the field, relying solely on my Collab Lab experience and maybe little bits and pieces of things that are not, development related. So, working as a CNA or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's what's happening this week. This is the last week. I hope it's going well. Please let me know if you have feedback. With that, I will turn it over to Chris. Let me make sure you can share your screen for How to Rock the Technical Interview.
Awesome, thanks, Stacy. Let me get Sharon here. Desktop 2, great, okay. And I will hit the present button. Okay.
Beautiful.
So welcome everybody to my talk. My name is Chris Dopuch, and I'm here to talk about rocking the technical interview. Just a quick little blurb about me. I'm located here in Portland, Oregon. I work at Zapier as a software engineer along with Andrew and Stacy and probably a bunch of other people that you know from TCL. And I've been a professional software engineer for just about 7 years at the end of the month. So that's pretty exciting. And yeah, I'm hoping to share some of the wisdom that I've learned around technical interviewing and help you to do the best job that you possibly can. So let's dig into our agenda. First, we're just gonna kind of talk generally about like, what is a technical interview? What makes it different from a normal interview? And get into that. We're also gonna talk about the structure and schedule of these interviews and what like a typical course of interviews might look for you interviewing at a tech company. We'll talk about making your best possible first impression and some overall strategies going into these interviews that you can employ to do your best. And then number 4, we're going to really get into the core subject, which is all about how to rock the technical interview. And we're going to go through step-by-step different steps that'll help you to prepare for answering these kind of questions and actually diving into answering and testing those questions. And then we're also going to add a little bit of additional content at the end to talk about the behavioral interview that is simultaneously happening within your technical interview and sort of some of the things that companies are looking for there. And we're also going to talk about ways that you can interview the company that is interviewing you, because an interview is always a two-way street, not only for the company to discover if they want to hire you, but also if you actually want to work at that company. Let me pop open the chat here so I've got that. Okay, cool. Thanks, Stacey. Alrighty, so what the heck even is a technical interview, right? So a technical interview is a format where you have one or more interviewers who are assessing your coding and technical problem solving abilities. Usually, you will be given one or more coding problems that you need to solve using code, or sometimes pseudocode. For example, a famous example of the interview coding question is the FizzBuzz question, which is print integers 1 to n being like the number of integers you're being given in a list of integers, but print the string fizz if an integer is divisible by 3, buzz if an integer is divisible by 5, and FizzBuzz if an integer is divisible both by 3 and 5. That's like an example question that you might possibly see in a technical interview. Your interviewers in these technical interviewers are going to be trained to assess the following. They want to look at how you're solving the problem, like what algorithms, what data structures are you using to solve the problem? What kind of questions are you asking about the problem? What kind of details are you able to suss out through your communication with the interviewer and by, being curious and asking questions and thinking out loud. And these companies, they also want to see how you behave under pressure, honestly. Like we all know it's hard to code in front of other people, it just is. But at the end of the day, at a job, you're going to be in situations where you're going to be under pressure and you've got to be able to deliver, certain features within a deadline, or you're going to have to be able to perform, while working with a lot of other people. So yeah, it's difficult, but companies also want to make sure that you do have these skills before they bring you on board. So it's really important to be able to, demonstrate your best self and to really show these companies that you're going to be a solid, dependable teammate and worker. So technical interviews are going to follow usually 3 common formats. So the most traditional option is a whiteboard interview. Nowadays, with COVID and sort of the world being the way that it is, like usually these are going to be done in an online format using Google Docs or something similar. But in a world where you are in person, you might actually physically be writing pseudocode up on a physical whiteboard like these people on the left here. For this kind of interview, it's going to be more important your ability to problem solve and your thought process, and you're really just mostly writing out pseudocode. You're not actually going to be able to execute the code. At least whiteboards haven't quite caught up to the technical execution to be able to do that yet. Maybe one day. But you're just going to kind of mentally step through the problem and sort of think through, like, does this solve it with the interviewer? So contrast that with another format, which I'm going to call full IDE support. So this is something where you're actually solving the problem by running real code in an integrated development environment, IDE, such as CoderPad or some other kind of online collaborative code editing tool. For this kind of interview format, it's going to matter a little bit more if you can actually get code that's working in the environment, right? Like if you can actually produce a solution that runs and produces the correct output, that's really going to be the ideal situation. Which has pros and cons, right? Like you actually do need to know the syntax and actually get code that will compile and run correctly. But on the other hand, because you actually get to run the code, you actually get to debug the output and employ a lot of the strategies that you would normally employ while just writing code, normally outside of an interview format. And also be able to take advantage of the things that a code editor gives you, like syntax highlighting and linting and type checking and all of that cool stuff. Finally, the last format that you might see is a take-home technical interview. This is actually personally my favorite. I've tended to succeed the most at companies that do this kind of interview. And I find that it actually mirrors like how working is, like more closely as opposed to these more sort of artificial formats. So basically you're given like a larger scope problem or project. Instead of like, solve this particular like algorithmic puzzle, it's usually more like build this app or build this backend API or something kind of larger in scope. And consequently, you're usually given a lot more time. So they're usually time boxed to like a single evening or maybe an entire weekend where you can spend all that time to just build out this project, as opposed to these other formats, which are usually like 30 minutes to an hour. And usually with a take-home exercise, like things like frameworks and libraries are going to be more permitted within reason, although usually companies are going to want you to articulate your reasons as to why you chose to use a particular framework and kind of give some pros and cons and like the trade-offs of, here's what it sort of cost us to use this, but here's why I think it's appropriate. And more so than the other formats, this one's going to be really important to make sure that you take notes and explain your thought process as you're coding. Like when you're coding out your solution and you think about some thing that you would have done or would have liked to do or something you'll fix in the future, et cetera, make sure you're writing that down actually, like in a notes file or just in inline comments in the code, because you're not necessarily going to have the opportunity to explain that stuff in person like you would have in the other two formats. So those are the three most common technical interview formats you'll find. That might not even be completely exhaustive, but most of the time it's going to be one of these three. So what are these companies actually looking for when they do these kinds of interviews? A few things. So, I mean, first and foremost, like the point, right, is to assess your coding aptitude. Like, are you actually able to solve the problem? Can you figure out the solution? Are you able to fully understand the problem and create a working solution? These companies are also looking at your what I'm going to call code reach, which is sort of like how much code, how much technical complexity are you able to fit in your head at once and kind of keep track of? And larger problems with more things to think about are going to require bigger code reach, and sort of the more things you can keep in your mind at once, that's ultimately a positive sign for you and your technical aptitude. But aside from just technical things, companies are also looking at a lot of other things as well, such as your ability to communicate. They're definitely going to be looking for you to ask questions and think out loud as you're working through the problem. If you maybe are normally the kind of person who will kind of go quiet and sort of focus internally while you think through a problem, that's totally cool. But I would encourage you to try to kind of get outside of that box a little bit during these kinds of interviews, because the more that you can articulate and the more that you can let the interviewer into your own mind, the better that they can understand your thought process, and that's ultimately going to reflect better on you. They're also going to be looking for things like code clarity, so things like descriptive variable names and code that is easily readable and well documented. Those are all going to be pluses in your favor in terms of these interview formats. And lastly, they're also definitely going to be sort of, looking at what your vibe is like during these interviews. You might feel like this woman here on the right, really nervous and, biting your fingernails in the middle of the interview. That's okay. That's going to be expected. Like, these interviewers are going to know that it's hard to do this. Like, they're going to expect you to be a little bit nervous. But as much as possible, you want to do your best to project positive attitude, project that sort of good teammate vibes, even if you get totally stumped. Just try to have fun with it and try to just stay determined and stick with the problem, and just kind of keep that upbeat attitude, because that's also going to really help you out. And there are totally going to be situations where you might not fully solve a problem, but because you asked the right questions, you thought through the solution really logically, and you kept your spirits up the whole time and kept a positive attitude, that might still be like a good interview for you at the end of the day. So things like vibe, communication, code clarity, all almost just as important, I would say, as the technical stuff itself. Now, I know what you're thinking, but that sounds hard, right? It totally is hard. It absolutely is hard. But you're going to be okay. You're going to find a great job. You're going to figure out how to do this and how to get better at it. Okay. Trust me. No one likes doing coding interviews, like, at least at first, right? It is definitely difficult. But there are some things working in your favor. Okay. For one, practice definitely helps with this kind of thing. And there's a lot of opportunities to practice, fortunately. You can do mock interviews with other people where they will give you these questions and you can practice this interview format. And that's going to help you get used to this. And it's also going to expand the number of challenges that you have seen and the number of like algorithms and things like that that you've been exposed to and form part of your coding toolbox that you can then reuse in later problems or challenges that you might run into. If you don't have people to do mock interviews with you, that's okay too. There's also tons of online resources for doing code challenges. Things like HackerRank or LeetCode, or right now there's Advent of Code going on, which is a series of coding questions that sort of count down to the end of the year. So there's lots of online opportunities to practice at this stuff. But at the end of the day, I mean, it is kind of a numbers game, honestly. Sometimes you will just go blank, like that totally happens. And I've been in interviews where I'm just like, well, I've literally never experienced this problem and I can't think of any good algorithms for it. So I'm just gonna kind of stumble my way through. And that happens, you know? Some questions are easier than others, some are harder. Sometimes you are familiar with a concept and sometimes you're just not. So just kind of be aware of that and don't beat yourself up too badly. If you do get something that you're not familiar with, just keep pressing on and you're eventually going to find that interview that just clicks and you're going to know the answer and it's going to work out well, but it just might take you a little bit to get there. So if you bounce off a few at first, you know, don't get discouraged, just keep going and just do your best. And you know, when you're in these interviews, you know, I know they're difficult and they're nerve-wracking, but just as much as possible, try to relax and just try to have fun with it. Try to treat it as just like a fun new challenge, a new way to stretch yourself, a new way to improve yourself. And if you can think about it that way, I think it's going to make it a little bit less stressful for you and probably result in you projecting a better experience for the interviewers. And it's also going to help you to not get as burnt out on the experience and to be able to kind of keep going through these and have success eventually. And remember, you know, I always tell this to people, determination is much more important than technical skill at the end of the day. It doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how much technical skill that you have. If you give up at the first time that you have difficulty, you know, you're never going to get what you really want. So just, you know, don't give up and keep going and just know it is a numbers game. And eventually with enough practice and enough shots, you're going to make that goal eventually. So with all that advice in mind, let's now talk about what these interviews typically look like from a schedule perspective. So most of the time, you're going to have several days worth of interviewing. They're probably not going to be like back to back like this. There's probably going to be like maybe a week gap between the first 3 columns, for example. Typically, things start off with like a recruiter phone screen on day 1. Some of you may have done these already. Usually, this is just kind of like lightweight. Recruiter just wants to, at a very high level, like see if you're a fit for the job, see if you know the technologies that the company is working with, and if you have roughly the amount of experience that they're looking for. And if you get past this screen, then usually you'll go into a series of interviews, usually like over the phone or done remotely. And usually these are either some combination of technical one-on-one interviews that are going to be, you know, just like what we've talked about, where you've got a coding question, you're sitting down with someone, you're working through the question. And they might also include a manager or teammates giving you a behavioral interview. That's going to be an interview where you don't necessarily have like a coding question to sit down and solve. They're more going to ask you like about experiences you've had at previous jobs or situations that you've had to resolve, you know, or difficulties that you faced and how did you overcome them, you know, kind of more general questions about your sort of career and also like how well that you're going to fit in with the culture, you know, of the company that you're interviewing at. So after, you know, maybe 1 or 2 days worth of those types of interviews, if you sort of make it all the way to the end, this is usually when most companies will have an on-site interview. Again, with the pandemic and COVID and all of that, I mean, this has really changed. I think probably most places aren't actually doing on-site interviews, but the idea remains the same, where you're going to have sort of a series of interviews over the course of either like a half day or maybe even a full day. And you know, be prepared for that because you're definitely a gauntlet to get through. If you drink caffeine, these are definitely good days to drink a lot of caffeine on because it's going to take a lot of energy to get through all that. But I know you can do it. And once you kind of get going, the energy sort of kind of carries you through the rest of them. But these are usually going to, again, have some combination of technical panels, behavioral interviews. And you might even get a few other kind of formats, like maybe a panel interview where there's multiple people doing either a technical or behavioral interview. Or you might even get like a system design interview with, say, like a CTO or a director or something like that, where it is technically focused, but it's not like a specific problem. It's more like a general question of like, how would you build a Twitter clone website? Or how would you build a photo sharing website? Like some sort of really big scope, sort of big picture problem. So that's kind of like a rough sketch of what you can expect. It is going to vary by company, but they all kind of generally fall into roughly this sort of schedule. So once you're actually at your interview, there are some things that you can do to make the best possible impression. So one thing is definitely make sure that you've got good lighting and that it's easy to see you and that you're not obscured by bad lighting. Like you don't want direct bright light immediately behind your head where like your whole face is in shadow or something like that. I mean, like I think my lighting right now is like pretty good. You could I'm fully lit. I've got a few different sources of light. You know, it's all pretty well lit here. So this is kind of a good example. Likewise, definitely recommend having a clean space to work in and a clean background. For one, it's going to help you to feel better. If you're in like a really messy area, that's going to like affect your mental space as well. So being in a really clean environment can help you to do your best, but it's also just going to help you to put the best foot forward, right? Like if someone's got a really messy bedroom in the background, like, I don't know, probably no one's going to just be like directly like, whoop, their room was messy, they cannot work at this company. But on the other hand, like you don't want that to maybe set a bit of a negative tone in their mind. So you just want to give yourself every chance to succeed, right? And similarly, you know, make sure that you've thought through what you're wearing. Most tech companies aren't going to be like super hardcore on the dress code. Most of them are going to be casual to business casual. But, you know, just make sure that you thought about it and wear something that you feel good in and feel confident in, right? Because that's at least half the battle, right? Is like, if you look good, you feel good. So definitely recommend that. And make sure you're thinking about this from head to toe too. I know with COVID and all this remote work, it's easy to kind of, you know, just like business on top, party on the bottom, you know, sitting there in your PJs, right? But in case you've got to, I don't know, stand up or something, just make sure you've actually got like real pants on or whatever while you're doing these interviews and not just some pajama pants or something. Definitely recommend wearing headphones for these kind of interviews. It's going to help you to stay focused, especially if you've got stuff that can block out noise from the external world. It's also probably going to help you out with your microphone situation. Like a built-in mic on headphones is going to sound better. It's going to read clearer to your interviewers. And the better they can understand you, the better the communication is going to go. That's just going to work in your favor. And if you've got like a fancy dedicated microphone, those are also really nice for that too. If you live with other people, like your family or a partner or roommates or something, definitely let them know that you're interviewing ahead of time. Give them a heads up, tell them when it's happening so that you can avoid them like knocking on your door, coming in, asking you questions, sending you texts, like and stuff that could be distractions. And similarly, make sure that you can avoid as many distractions as you can. Like mute your phone before going in, set do not disturb mode on your computer. Just make sure that you can like drown out those external distractions and really focus and do your best. And lastly, if a company that you're interviewing with gives you like a link to a coder pad or a Google Doc or something like that in advance, make sure you've tested it out. Because if there are problems, if you can get those sorted out before the interview, that's just going to work in your favor because you're going to have more time to focus on the interview itself. And it might even like be a good impression, right? Like, because if you're really on top of things and you're prepared, that's going to reflect well on you, you know, as well in the interview. So definitely test those links out in advance if you have the opportunity. Okay, so now we're going to talk about like the actual technical interview itself and some strategies for ways that you can be the best programmer possible, like this cat, and make the computer go beep, boop, beep, boop, boop. So the first thing, sort of step 0 here, is making sure that you understand the interview format itself. Most of the time, you're going to have like 30 minutes to an hour where they're going to ask you maybe 1 to 3 questions in the interview. That's probably what you're going to experience in most cases. That's what we're going to move forward with, assuming in this presentation. But be aware that some companies, for example, LinkedIn, might actually have a different format where instead of focusing on like 1 or 2 questions, they actually go for like quantity over quality approach, where they just want to see how many small coding problems can you solve within a single interview. If this is the kind of interview that you're going into, usually these interviewers are going to flag that beforehand. They're going to explain it to you. So just be aware that that might be what you could experience. And in those situations, it's going to be a little bit more important to just actually like solve a larger number of problems rather than taking a lot of time to explain yourself and like think out loud and all of that stuff. So just be aware that you understand the format and realize that most of the tips I'm going to give you here mostly apply to the first format. So understanding the format out of the way, the next thing that we need to understand is the question itself. Before you start writing any code or pseudocode or anything, it's really important to ask clarifying questions about the question itself. Most employers actually are looking specifically for you to ask questions, and they're looking at what kind of questions that you're asking, because that's super important as software engineers, right? Like every day, people are coming to me in my job and telling me to build this or build that, but I've always got to ask questions like, do you want it to do this? Should it not do this? Is it okay if it does this? You know, what is the output? What is the input? Like those are the questions that you as an engineer are going to be asking every day in your job. And that's also super true of the coding questions in these interview formats. Some interviewers actually even have useful information that they're not going to reveal unless you ask for it. So make sure that you ask those questions. Some good things to ask about would be, for example, asking for example input or example output to the problem if they didn't provide any. You could also ask for additional input examples, maybe if they only gave you one. You could also suggest your own input and output examples. This is a great way to make sure that you have a full understanding of the problem. You might even suggest like, oh, okay, so could the input, you know, be like this array with like something like this? And they might be like, oh, no, like, don't worry, there'll never be negative numbers or something like that, right? Like you can through giving examples, suss out what some of those parameters of the exercise are. And speaking of sussing out parameters, definitely ask about your edge cases. So, you know, it's good to kind of think about this a little bit like a QA engineer as well. Be thinking about, you know, like, well, what happened? Like, is it possible for the program to receive no input? You know, is that something that I should worry about? Or like, will the input be sorted? You know, or what is the maximum size of the input that I might possibly receive? Will it contain negative numbers? You know, things like that. Those are all really great questions to ask in almost any situation, honestly. You should also ask about error handling. Ask, you know, about like what should happen if the program has to crash and terminate, you know, like what should it do? And asking about error handling and those error cases is also, I think, just going to reflect positively on you too as an engineer, because it shows that you're thinking about not just like the successful case, but also the things that might go wrong. And that's totally something that we have to think about a lot as engineers. So even if you don't necessarily get into like really complex, like try, catch, exception handling and stuff in your algorithms, which you probably won't, you're probably going to more focus on like the positive case. Still, like thinking about and asking about those error handling is going to be you know, a positive thing for you as an interviewee. So let's give another example question here that we can kind of like follow through thinking about. So an example might be, given a list of numbers as your input and a target number k, return whether any two numbers in your list add up to k. So some good things that might be worth clarifying with this question would be, can the same number be repeated? For example, if my list is 1, 5, and 2, and the value for k, that target value is 4, well, with 2, could I like add 2 to itself to get 4? Like, is that valid? You know, like that would be really good to get clarity on. You could also ask, like, will the input list be sorted? That could totally be relevant for solving this question. A really good question to ask for virtually any algorithm is space or running time more important? Like, is it okay if we consume a large amount of memory in order to solve the problem faster? Or is it, excuse me, is it more important to reduce our space usage and potentially run slower, right? Like that's one of the very common trade-offs when it comes to computing algorithms. And it's going to be relevant for like almost any problem that you solve. And asking about the output in this case would be really good because our prompt like really doesn't indicate really what our output should be at all. So getting clarity on that would be really valuable. Like, should it just return true or false? Like if it does or doesn't contain a tuple that works, or should it return the numbers that added up to that target, or maybe the indexes of those numbers? You know, you've got a lot of different options. And probably your interviewer is going to kind of have an idea of what they expect, and they'll just let you know what they want. So once you've got your question clarified, it's time to start brainstorming some ideas. And remember, an inefficient solution is still a solution at the end of the day. It's usually not a bad idea to start off with a sort of brute force answer where you might employ an algorithm which is less efficient initially, but easier to understand and easier to implement. And then refine it as you go. You know, you can create a solution that might not be very optimal, but then improve it as the interview goes on. Or maybe you don't even improve it. Maybe you just sort of talk through like, here are the limitations of this algorithm, and here are ways that I would improve it, you know, if I had more time. Like that's also a totally valid discussion. But your interviewer is definitely going to want to hear from you about the trade-offs between space and runtime and about the efficiency of the algorithm. You may or may not have heard of this type of notation. It's called Big O. It has no relation at all to the anime from the 2000s, but I just needed an image for the slides. So here we go, Big O. Be ready to talk about this. So as just a super fast crash course on this, like Big O notation basically indicates how efficiently your algorithm operates as a function of the size of the input data. You know, so if you have an algorithm that like just loops through a list of numbers once, that's going to be Big O of n, because n is the size of your list and you go through that list once. But let's say that you have an algorithm where each iteration of the list, you also have to iterate through the list a second time for some other reason. Well, that would end up being the list multiplied by the length of the list. So that would be Big O of n squared. Those are just some quick examples. Maybe you are already familiar with Big O. Great, this is just a reminder. If you're not familiar with the idea of Big O, I do recommend maybe going out there and watching like a YouTube video or something on it, because even just having like a basic level of understanding there is really going to go a long way in terms of being able to articulate the trade-offs and runtime efficiency of your algorithm. And that's going to be important, not just for interviews, but also for like discussing the merits of different algorithms, different solutions with other engineers, like at your actual job later on. Like I do actually use this probably maybe once in a blue moon, but blue moons do happen. So it is valuable. You know, you do want to know about this stuff. You also should think through the different data structures that are going to help you solve the problem and evaluate which ones would be a good fit. You know, again, this is going to be something where the more algorithms and data structures that you expose yourself to, the more tools that you're going to have in your toolbox. Know which problems are solved well by which data structures. Like, you know, for example, you might run across a problem where it's like, oh, I could use a hash map in order to keep track of all the data that I need in this this puzzle, and that's going to help me to improve the performance because it's going to have O of 1 lookup time, which is very efficient, you know, things like that. Or using like a tree or a heap or all the different kind of structures, stacks, etc. Be familiar with those and, you know, be ready to apply those to these problems. If you are not familiar with any of the terminology that I just used, that's okay too, don't panic. But I do recommend starting to learn and starting to maybe pick up a book on data structures or algorithms and start learning that stuff, because again, the more tools that you've got in your toolbox, the more likely that you're going to be able to solve whatever problems come in front of you. And lastly, you know, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again, and this won't even be the last time, but make sure that you're thinking out loud as you're going through this. Like even your bad ideas, right? Like think through them out loud, because if you come up with like a bad idea and you're like immediately like, wait, that won't work because of this, even being able to articulate why that bad idea didn't work is still a good thing to your interviewer. Like that's still them seeing you reason through a problem and getting like a demo of your thought process, which is really what they want to like dig into and understand. So once you've fleshed out the question and brainstormed the different options as to how you could tackle the problem, ultimately you should decide on one of them and write out some pseudocode or comments, roughly sketching out what that algorithm is going to be. This is going to serve as kind of like a rough draft or a framework that's going to help you to actually write out the code. So hopefully most of you are familiar with pseudocode, but if you're not, here's an example of some pseudocode. It's just writing out in plain English or whatever language that you are most comfortable with, just sort of the rough algorithm of what your code is going to do. Once you've written out that pseudocode, you can use that as a framework to then write out your solution. Make sure, again, to talk through what you're doing while you're coding. Think of it almost like narrating what you're doing. Like as you're writing out that code, talk through like, this is what this is doing. This is why I'm doing this. I'm keeping track of this thing with this variable for this reason, etc. The interviewers want to know that you understand how your solution works, not just that you're able to sort of, from memory recite some solution that you've memorized or something like that, right? Like they really want to see that you understand what's going on, and talking through that is going to help them to see that. And they want to see you to make decisions about how to handle this problem and the trade-offs that you're making, and they want to know why you're making those decisions. Because if you can articulate, why you're doing something and the reasons behind that, that's going to reflect better on you and show your technical aptitude and your communication skills, right? Which again is what they're looking for in these interviews, right? So let's look at some possible solutions for this example question, just to kind of give some concrete examples here. So to reiterate the question, given a list of numbers and a target number k, return whether any two numbers in your list add up to k. First, let's talk about the solution on the left. So this solution is pretty interesting because it starts off by taking the number array and sorting it. So we know past that point that we've got a sorted array of numbers. And then they use a while loop as well as two different variables to keep two different pointers into the array. One of them starts at the beginning of the array at 0, and the other starts at the end of the array, equal to the length of the array. So while the first pointer is less than the second pointer, meaning our two values have not yet intersected in the middle, we're going to loop through the array. And we're going to check if the array at I plus the array at j is equal to our target, which it would be k in the question, right? And if they're equal, we've done it. We've solved our problem, right? Like we found the solution, or at least a solution, and we can return those two indexes is the particular outputting format that we use here. But otherwise, if we don't discover that that was a solution, then we're going to check if nums at I and nums at j is less than the target value. That means that the next number that we would have to add in order to get up to the target needs to be bigger. So what we're going to do is increment our lower bound, which is I. So now we're going to like bump I so that we're now looking at a larger number. On the other hand, if those two numbers added together were larger than the target, in that case, we'll do the opposite. We'll reduce our upper bound by decrementing j. And eventually those numbers will meet in the middle. And if they've met in the middle and we didn't find any possible combination of values that works, then we'll just return an empty array and say, there wasn't any matches, right? So that's a pretty interesting solution on the left. I think it's kind of clever using two different values to keep track of two different pointers into the array, and then using those to iterate through both the top and bottom of the array. But now let's take a look at the right-hand solution, which is another approach that I think is also pretty interesting. So In this one, we're going to take advantage of the map data structure in JavaScript. Sorry, I should have said these solutions are in JavaScript, just for reference here. Hopefully that's a language most of you are familiar with. So in this solution, we instantiate a new map, and then we just iterate once through the numbers. And for each number, we check if the target value k minus that particular number, if we have seen that number, right? Like if it's returned from the map and it isn't undefined, then we know that we've found a solution. Because if the current number subtracted from target is a number that we've seen, that means that the number that we've seen already plus the current number that we're looking at equals the target, right? So we found a place where the two numbers add up to the target and we can return that. But if we haven't seen it, then what we do is we set that number that we just iterated over into the map. So over time, we build up a map containing these numbers, and we can quickly ascertain by looking at the map what we've seen before and see if we can find something that matches something that we've seen that is a value that will add up with the current value to equal the target value. And I think this solution is also pretty interesting because this is a great example of the trade-off between time and space, right? So on the left, we have a solution that is using less space, but taking a little bit more time. It takes more time because we first have to sort the array, and then we iterate through the whole array. So it takes a little bit more time. On the right, we take more space, and we take up more space because we create a new map data structure, and we have to build up this data structure containing the items in the array. And so we're spending some of our memory, but we save some time because this solution doesn't require us to sort the array. And also, fortunately, accessing members from the map is very quick and efficient. So we can always check if we have already seen another value that could possibly result in a successful answer to the question. So those are a couple of examples of how you might solve this and how you might talk through some of the merits and trade-offs of the two solutions. So once you've written your solution out, now it's time to test it out. A good thing to do is to take some of the example input that your interviewer provided with you and use that to test your code. You may also want to come up with some new test cases if necessary. That might help you to flush out different bugs or test different edge cases with your code. As far as like how you actually test your code, you've got a couple options. If you're doing like a whiteboard type coding exercise where you're mostly just writing out pseudocode, the best thing to do is going to be to step through it line by line and in your own mind, keep track of what the variables are going to be. Before they invented computers, the best computer that we had was humans, and you are a human and you can compute things. So that's kind of fun and empowering in a way, right? But if you actually are running things in a real IDE, you can also just like actually run code, right, in order to test it. So when you're testing your code, be looking for likely errors that you have made, especially if it doesn't return the output that you expected it to. Some common places, just like some heuristics for things that you can check that are usually, culprits for this would be things like Boolean logic, right? Like less than, greater than, like, oops, I used less than when I actually meant to use less than or equal to, something like that is a common mistake that you can make. Also checking for the value of fence post or flag variables, or checking if you've accidentally made like an off by one error, like, oops, I should have set that to the length of the array -1, not the length of the array. That's a really common coding error too. And also be thinking about your type issues too. If you're not using a strongly typed language, like JavaScript, for example, because you could end up in some trouble there and maybe get a wrong value because you're casting something inappropriately or making the wrong assumption about a type value. So let's give an example for how you can mentally compute and test your algorithm just using your own brain. So in this case, we're going to use this array as our input for nums, and the target is going to equal 9. So we start off by instantiating our map, right? And what this person has done here is they've put comments sort of explaining like what is happening at each layer of execution. So when we start off, the map is an empty object, right? And then we go into our loop iteration down here. So on the first iteration, our map is empty. So the .get operation is always going to return nothing because it's empty. So we know that this is going to evaluate to false. So we're going to go into our else block, and then we're going to set in the map nums at I. And that is going to be the value 2, because 2 is the first item in our array. So now our map looks like this. It's got a key of 2 and the value is the array that it's at, which is 0, or the index of the array, which is 0. So then we go back up to the top of our for loop and we iterate again. And this time, nums at I is equal to 7, right? And we take k, which is 9, and we subtract 7 from 9, which results in a value of 2. Now, when we do scene.get2, we know that that's going to return true because our map right now at this point of our execution has a key of 2. So that's going to return a truthy value, which means it's not equal to undefined. So we go into our success case here. We've found a value that when we add the 2 together, they result in the target value. And so then we return that tuple containing 0 and 1, the indexes of the 2 numbers. And this makes sense, right? 2 plus 7 is 9. Boom, we did it. Looks like our algorithm, at least for this example, is working. Another option for testing your code is using what is called a truth table. This might be something that you've experienced in coursework or something like that. It's basically a way of sort of systematically stepping through all of the possible permutations of the values of your code. I think in this particular example, just stepping through line by line is probably the best thing to do. I have used truth tables, though, in order to debug my code, usually when it comes to like complex Boolean logic, where I've got multiple conditions that I'm checking, and I want to write out like all of the possible conditions and make sure that the values that I'm using there are correct. So if you have a problem that looks more like that, this might be a more valuable testing methodology for you. And then lastly, if you've kind of gone through it, mentally and kind of checked things out, and you have the ability to, yeah, now is the time to run your code in your IDE. So, boot it up, and if you run it successfully, great, you win. And if it doesn't produce the output that you want, then now is the time to debug and engage with the various debugging strategies that you know and probably love or don't love. I don't know. Things like console logging things, using the debugger, all that good stuff, on commenting code out, things like that. So we've talked about the technical side of the interview, how to understand the question, how to tackle it, and how to test and make sure that your solution is correct. But that's not all that's going on. There's also, at the same time, a behavioral interview that's occurring while your technical interview is going on. Again, you're being evaluated on how you are able to respond to problems under pressure. They want to see you be curious. They want to see you be open and ask a lot of questions, and really dig into all of the edge cases and permutations of the code. And your ability to ask those kinds of questions and communicate is going to reflect well on not just your technical understanding, but also your behavioral characteristics and how you're going to fit in culturally at this company. If you need to Google something during the interview, that's also totally okay. You can feel free to ask your interviewer, like, hey, I don't quite remember this one thing. I don't remember like what this one method accepts or whatever. Is it okay if I Google that? Some people are going to tell you that you totally can, and that's great. Other people are going to say like, nah, it's not important. Like, don't worry about it. Just assume that it's this. You'll probably see that more commonly in like a whiteboard type interview. And if you're at home doing a take-home exercise, like obviously probably no one can stop you from using Google. So you definitely find to do it there. And if you get stuck on something really specific, just let the interviewer know. I mean, just be open and honest and humble about what you're experiencing in that moment. Because again, like that's a situation that you're going to run into in the real world, in your work, right? Like you're going to run into situations where you're totally stumped and you just need someone's help to unblock you and get past something. So it's totally fine to treat your interviewer as a resource as well. At the end of the day, we all Google things, we all use Stack Overflow and copy and paste solutions and things like that. So just be realistic about your own expectations and come to the interview knowing that that's okay if you need to ask for that kind of stuff. So some other tips that I can give you around the behavioral interview side of things. These I think are both going to be applicable for the technical interview, which again is also kind of a behavioral interview in its own way. But these are also going to be really useful advice for specifically behavioral interview questions where people are going to sit down and ask you like situations where they're like, give me an example of like a conflict at work or a difficult situation that you had to deal with or something like that, right? One thing that can be really useful in these kinds of interviews is to familiarize yourself with the values or the mission statement of the company that you're interviewing at. So for example, this here is a link out to the Amazon leadership principle questions. So like, let's say that you're interviewing at Amazon, right? You can look at what Amazon's leadership principles are. And you can, like in this case, actually, Amazon has a series of interview questions that relate back to those leadership principles. So that's actually just great practice material, frankly. But also this process of like looking at a company's values and understanding what they are, and then figuring out ways that you can connect your own experiences to those values is really going to help you to shine in those interviews, because that's exactly what these interview folks are looking for, right? Like they're looking for people that match up with the leadership principles, with the values, and with the mission statement of the company. And if you can demonstrate the ways that you jive well with that kind of culture or that kind of value system, then you're going to be setting yourself up for success in the interview. One thing that can be helpful is to utilize what is called the STAR method. That is an acronym meaning situation, task, action, and result. It's basically just a framework for understanding how to sort of like tell your story or narrate situations that you've experienced in your career. So start off with the situation of sort of setting the scene of like, I was working here, I was on this team, and we were working on this thing, and we had this project going on, right? Then talk about what the task at hand was. Like, we were trying to get this feature done and shipped out the door by this date, or we were trying to come up with a design for this system, or we were trying to, solve this particular incident that had occurred and prevent it from happening again, something like that. And then state the action that you took in order to resolve that task. Stay concrete with this. Make sure that you're talking about like specific actions that you took, specific things that you implemented in the code, or specific processes maybe that you created or changed or things like that. And then relate those actions that you took to a direct result or outcome of what it was that resulted from you taking that action. This could be like, I did this thing, or I used this algorithm or framework in order to improve our efficiency, and we were able to, as a result, deliver our objective, 1 week in advance, or something like that would be a great example of like a really concrete result. And just making those results concrete and those actions very specific is going to help your interviewers to really understand what the situation was and what value that it was that you brought to the table as an employee. Because that's what they're looking for, right? They're looking for, how did you add value to a company, and are you going to be valuable for us as a company to bring onto our team and to help us out and to take the actions that we want and to get the results that we want, right? So this is just a way of narrating that story in a way that's going to be really persuasive and compelling for the interviewers. So here are some example behavioral interview questions that you might see. A kind of interesting one would be something where someone kind of gives you like a problem, like a hypothetical problem that you might be experiencing. Like say, for example, okay, we have a production system and the database read replica is lagging behind the main database. And I need you to debug this problem. So pretend I'm the computer, what do you do? And that could be kind of like a back and forth thing of like, I might say like, okay, well, I SSH into the machine and I do this particular command to figure out like, what is the network usage or something like that. And they might kind of do like a role-playing situation with you basically. Another really common format or a question for this format would be just focusing on particular technical topics and asking you to explain them or asking you to talk about solutions that you've implemented using these technologies. So like explain what React is to me, or explain what the DOM is, the document object model, like explain polymorphism to me, something like that, right? And this is going to be a little bit more like a kind of a trivia thing. So it's partially testing like, how much do you know? What concepts have you been exposed to technically? But that's not all. It's also testing your ability to explain and articulate those things too. Because as engineers, we don't just have to know things and be smart. We also have to explain them to other people who don't know them or maybe don't understand why they're important, right? So that's a really critical skill. And it's one that this interview format can kind of help to suss out. And then like I mentioned before, another really common format is going to be like, tell me about a time when you did blank, like when you solved a difficult problem and how did you do it? Or you had a conflict with your colleague, like how did you resolve it? What did you do? Or you had two urgent and competing priorities, et cetera. These are all questions that I would bet money that you will have in an interview at some point. And because you know that ahead of time, you can prepare answers for these questions. Like you can sit down and think through each of these and think about, okay, what is a time that I did have a conflict with a colleague, and kind of refresh yourself mentally on those. Write them down even, like put them in a journal or in a Google Doc or something and just review that before you go into an interview to prime yourself and put that back into your working memory so that you can come up with those, on the fly, because that's going to be a lot better than someone being like, tell me about a time you solved a difficult problem. And you're just like, well, I don't know. I don't have any difficult problems that I've ever solved. Like, you don't want to be in that situation, right? I'm sure you've all solved really difficult problems. And so brag on yourself, it's important. Okay, and I think basically the last bit here that we can talk about is this whole interview process is not just to figure out if you're a good fit for the company, it's also to figure out if the company is a good fit for you. So make sure that you have questions prepped for the end of the interview. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just a good list of things that you might want to think about. Ask about the company culture, the engineering culture, the hours worked, vacation, benefits, all that kind of stuff. And make sure you've got some of these questions prepped, because if they get to the end of the interview and they're like, so what questions do you have for us? And you're just like, nothing. That's also, A, probably not going to reflect well on you, but like B, you need to know this stuff, right? Like you want to work at a good company and you're not going to only interview with good companies, like chances are, right? So you need to be able to sort of find those red flags and figure out like, oh, they never take vacation. Huh, maybe I don't want to work at this company, something like that. So a couple more resources that I can recommend if you want to keep learning on this topic, because I've only really just kind of touched on the tip of the iceberg. I've got some links here to some practice websites that contain coding challenges like Geeks for Geeks, LeetCode, HackerRank. And if you really want to get into this topic and you really, really want to dial in and try to get a job with one of those like FANG companies or those top tech companies, I really recommend checking out Cracking the Coding Interview by Gail Ackman McDowell. I read this book back in the day. It's really going to help you to understand a lot more in detail, like what these companies are looking for, what the interviews are going to be like, and really help you as a primer on concepts like Big O, data structures, common algorithmic questions, et cetera. So definitely recommend those resources if you want to dive deeper on this stuff. And with that, that's pretty much a wrap. You're going to do great, okay? You're going to find a great company, you're going to impress them, and you're going to keep practicing, you're going to learn more, and you're going to do great. Even though it's hard, you're going to keep trying and you're going to succeed. So Thank you. That's all I got. I took the whole dang hour, so hopefully we've got some question time, but if not, that's cool too. But more than happy to answer whatever questions y'all have.
Yeah, like I think that Caitlin's already here, and I think Caitlin's presentation will be quite a bit shorter than this one. So if we want to take like 10 minutes, if anybody has any questions, I know that that's a lot of information and it can be intimidating and a little overwhelming, but like Chris said, you're going to rock it. And it really does just take a lot of practice. And you know what? Probably the first few are going to be very uncomfortable and you're going to feel very awkward and embarrassed about them if you're anything like me. But then after that, things start to get a little bit easier and it becomes more predictable. And Chris, you did such a brilliant job of laying out some of the things that, you know, you might not be expecting if you haven't talked about this topic a lot, so that hopefully it won't be totally unexpected whenever you come into these situations and you see some of these questions and stuff. But it might be a little uncomfortable. You're going to do amazing. Just keep at it. Okay. Any questions for Chris while he's here?
And they can't be technical questions. I'm not going to solve any of those in front of you right now. Sorry.
I love one thing that you said, and there one thing that's tripped me up personally in some technical interviews is not being comfortable or familiar with the tool that they have you code on. So if they don't tell you in advance what you'll be using, ask them like what tools are going to be involved in this, because that will throw the whole thing off. If you're like, I don't even know how to run code in this thing that you're giving me. So make sure you are familiar or at least know what those things are that you're going to be working with.
For sure. Yep.
Any questions?
Will you be sharing the slides later too, Stacy? Because there's some links in here that hopefully will be useful for people.
Totally, yeah. Would you mind just popping those in that cohort channel too? That'd be super helpful. And I'll add this recording to anybody who didn't make it so they can watch it afterwards. Okay.
Cool.
Jennifer has one.
Yeah, got one from Jennifer. Yeah, if you do get a take-home assignment and you need more time than allotted, I think it sort of depends on why you need that additional time. Like, let's say that you have kids and something came up and they just consumed all your time this weekend, you know, or just something like happened and you didn't have enough time to work on it. Just let the company know. They'll probably be pretty flexible with like rescheduling it or whatever, or just giving you some extra time. Like, I think most places are probably going to be pretty flexible about that, especially if, you know, you've got like a really good reason as to why you couldn't do it. On the other hand, let's say that, no, really, you worked all weekend and you just didn't like finish it and you just need more time. I would probably not recommend asking for more time. What I would do is just submit what you've got, document how much you were able to get done and what you would do if you had more time to keep going. That's really like the instruction that most places are going to give you. They just want to see how much you can get done within the allotted time. And then they're just going to assess what you did get done. And actually, a lot of places will give you a project that is like large enough in scope that it's actually probably unlikely that you'll get to finish it completely. So that's actually pretty normal. You know, just be willing to sort of cut it off at some point and make sure you leave yourself a little bit of time at the end just to kind of wrap it up with a bow and write your notes down and like explain sort of where you left it off. Almost like, you know, it was like a project at work that you're leaving off for another one of your like your teammates or something like that, you know.
I love that insight. And that's like something that people ask a lot at Career Lab too, is if I didn't get the whole thing, what do I do? 1 second, buddy. And I think that it's really important to, before you even dive into the code, is doing that pseudocoding that Chris was talking about, having a notes file in your project so that when it comes to the end and you didn't wrap up, you don't even have to spend that much time like tying the bow because it's already done. You already have like outlined, here's exactly where I need to do these things and a to-do list. So just don't ever underestimate the power of preparation, like in that I'm going to prepare what code I'm going to write first and document my approach and then move forward.
Right. Totally.
Other questions? If you don't have them now, that is totally fine. I'm sure you will at some point, and we're all here for you. Chris is in Slack, so if you want to tag him in particular, please do. The rest of us are here for you too. So ask the questions, be loud about them, be transparent about them, like in open channels so that everybody can see, because we all have a lot to learn together and we can all grow. So we'd love to see, you know, the answers to some of those things that you kind of are running into. Okay, Thank you so much, Chris. That was beautiful. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to stop this recording and try and start another one. And we're going to see how that goes. So stop.